Welcome back to our cottage garden. It's the end of June and today we're going to take you on a tour of the roses that we're growing in our garden. Most of our roses are from David Austin. I visited their shop maybe 3 or 4 years ago, pre-pandemic, and that was before we moved house. Made a list of all the ones we liked, and then every time we've been able to afford one, we've been buying them and adding them to the garden. We've been adding them to the garden for about 3 years. Most of them were actually added this year, so a lot of them are quite small, but I'll show you the established ones as well to give us a sense of what we've got to look forward to, and I'm also going to show you a little bit about how we look after them. So first of all, let's walk towards the house and I'll show you our first rose. This rose here is called the Pilgrim. It's a climbing rose by David Austin. I'm actually just going to do some deadheading on this one as it's got quite a lot of spent blooms already. This one we only planted a couple of weeks ago, so it's new to us, and I'd love to train it over the door, but I think the way the sun lands in this space, it will do better if I train it over this window behind me, which will still be quite pretty. So I will probably, over the years, train that so that the branches go this way and they'll frame that window really nicely. It's this really lovely soft yellow colour, and I think this is the only yellow rose we've got in the garden. Initially I chose lots of pink colours, but other colours are starting to grow on me now, so I think I'll be adding more whites and yellows over the next few years. So let's go ahead and deadhead this one. I deadhead all of the roses that will repeat flower, and it just means the plant's going to put its energy into creating new blooms instead of forming rose hips. On the roses that don't repeat flower, I don't deadhead them because the rose hips are a good food for the birds. And it also just helps the roses to look a bit tidier when you remove the spent flowers as well. That one's coming off, we'll take that off. Sometimes it feels a little bit ruthless when you're taking off so many of the flowers, but it's definitely a good thing to do to prolong the flowering season. And these repeat flower really well. We'd probably get 3 or 4 flushes of flowers in the summer months, starting from about June time. So I think I've gotten all of the spent flowers now. And that one's looking much better already. Let's head up the garden and I'll show you our other flowers. So nestled onto the fence beside me is a rose called Claire Austin. This is another climber by David Austin, and this one's doing really, really well. I'm actually surprised by how well this one's doing because this is our worst area for soil in the garden. It's very, very heavy clay, although that does mean there's more nutrients in there. I wasn't expecting it to enjoy itself as much as it is. You can see there's loads of buds on this one, and it's a really like soft cream white colour, very delicate, pretty rose. I put this one in 2 years ago, which explains why it's a bit bigger than some of the other ones we've got, and it's put on a lot of growth. So I'm going to climb in and show you it close up, and I'm also going to do a bit of deadheading on this one as well. This one may need tying in soon. I usually just tie the roses in winter, but it's put on so much new growth. It might benefit from me tidying it up a little bit now. And when I deadhead the roses, I take the bud back to the nearest junction, I guess you'd call it, on the stem, so that that's where the new growth will form. You don't want to just cut them at the base of the flower. You need to go back to the junction, otherwise this bit of the stem will die. Need to do a bit of rummaging to get closer. I'd say so far this year, this has been the most successful of the roses. It's flowered once already with a massive flush of flowers, and there's so many new buds on here, I'm really amazed. Okay, I think that's probably most of that one deadheaded. We can now go up the garden and I'll show you some more roses. So if any part of our garden was going to be called a rose garden, it would be this area. This is where I planted most of the roses that we bought immediately when we moved in. So these have been here for 3 years. They're a really amazing size now, really lovely. I actually look back at some of the choices that I made, and I don't always like the flowers that I chose, but because they're so big and healthy, I have left them in. And my feelings have changed somewhat over time while we've added more flowers to this bit, but initially I thought this area was a bit too pink and I wanted to tone it down a little bit. So the first roses that I planted when we moved in are called Queen Elizabeth, and I didn't buy these from David Austin, I just got them from our local garden centre. They're a floribunda rose, so they can get really leggy and tall, like you can see behind me. I didn't expect it to get this tall this year. I pruned it really hard in the winter, quite low down, but I will be pruning it harder this time, seeing what's happened to it now. But they are a really vibrant pink rose, a little bit too vibrant for my liking, but they are so healthy and they love the soil here, so I do want to leave them in, but I don't think I would buy them again, probably. This rose is called Compassion, and this is a climbing rose. This is another one that I bought from our local garden centre. However, I think David Austin does carry this one if it's one that you want to grow. So it's a climber, and my aim with this is to cover the fence somewhat, to work as sort of a screen, so that we have this foliage in the months outside of winter, and then obviously in summer we have these amazing big flowers. And this is another one that I don't love the colour because it's quite vibrant. It's an orangey, peachy, yellow, pink colour. But I do really like what happens to this as it's been flowering for a few days and the sun starts to mute the colour slightly. And I think that's how I feel about this area of the garden as a whole. When the flowers first emerge, they're a bit bright for my liking, but after a few days it becomes really nice and muted and more of a kind of aged feel, which I much prefer. So again, this is a rose that's thriving, it's doing really well. I haven't deadheaded it yet, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And you can see this is a repeat flowerer as well. So we've had a flush already and now we've got our second flush of flowers. And you can see another set of buds emerging for when this flush of flowers finishes. And I love the way that these roses flower in bunches on a single stem. It looks really high impact. When I was pruning this one in winter, I tried to train it in swoops. What I learned was if you train a rose in a kind of curved shape, it sends more upwards growth, and then you end up with more flowers at like a good visible height. However, I think what I've learned from doing that is that these are flowering too high up and I would like them to flower a bit lower down. So I'll probably prune this harder in the winter, but it's such an ongoing process. This is only my third year of growing roses, and each year I learn so much. Find new varieties that I just fall in love with, and it's a long process. But I do find them a very easy and rewarding flower to grow. A good tip is to clean your snips between pruning the different roses to prevent the spread of things like black spot. I'm actually not doing that now, but usually I do. And then when I'm disposing of the remnants of the roses, I put this in the green waste bin just in case there is any black spot on here. You can see some of the leaves don't look the healthiest, so I won't compost this, I'll put it in the green waste bin. And that is Compassion. I'm amazed at this one, it's done really well this year, and the colours seem quite different this year. I don't know if that's something to do with the composition of the soil, but it looks much nicer than it did last year. So next to Compassion, we've got Olivia Rose Austin. I'll just move slightly so I can show you this one. So here is Olivia Rose Austin. This is trained as a standard, so it looks like a tree, and the flowers are then quite high up, which means I've got space to underplant it with things like geraniums. I haven't finished underplanting this one, so the soil is a little bit bare, but we'll get there over time. This one I planted when we moved in, so it's been in here for 3 years, and it is an amazing size now. I love this one. It has a really gorgeous smell. It's a bit like Turkish Delight, and it's a gorgeous soft pink colour, almost fades to sort of a greyish colour. I think this is probably my favourite in terms of colour, smell and the way the flowers look. I guess that's the most reasons, maybe we can say this one's my favourite. So I think I've got about four Olivia Rose Austin plants, 2 of which are trained as a standard. I'll show you the second one in a minute, but it's not as healthy as this one. Again, I haven't deadheaded this one yet, so let's go ahead and take off some of the spent blooms. But you can see this is another repeat flowerer. We've had a flush already that's gone over. We're in our second flush and it's preparing for a third with all of these nice little buds on there. So this is something that flowers really continuously throughout the summer and such a good thing to have in the garden. In the winter, how I care for these roses, we've got 2 methods of looking after them. And There's nothing scientific about those two methods. It's just because the dogs eat the compost if we mulch these with compost. So higher up the garden, they get a nice thick mulch of homemade compost, and then lower down the garden, they get store-bought compost because the dogs are less interested in eating that. And these roses also get a homemade fertilizer that's made from our food waste. So we do hot composting, and as the food composts in the container, it releases off a liquid. I believe it's called lechleid, something similar to that. It's a brown liquid. It works really well as a plant food, so you dilute it with some water and then pour that on here. I probably do that once a week, once every 2 weeks, and it feeds the plant while it's in flower. And then at the top of the garden, I use a seaweed fertilizer, and I usually foliar feed, which means I spray the leaves in the evening, and that's how we look after them. Because this is such a vigorous rose, sometimes pruning it's a little bit tricky because it's quite spiky, it can get scratched, so you just need to be a bit careful. And these just look so much better after a good prune. They look really tidy, really showy, and there's still so many flowers on there. You expect it to look a bit patchy, but it doesn't. These just fall apart as soon as you cut them off. Shows that they're ready to be cut. So I'm going to empty this into our green waste bin, and then I will return and show you the rest of our roses. I just want to quickly show you our second Olivia Rose Austin standard rose. You can see this one's much smaller despite having planted it at the same time 3 years ago. And partly I think this is due to it being in a pot. And at this point I probably should refresh the compost so it's got some new nutrients in there. And I also think it's to do with how the sun falls on the garden, so things do bloom better on this side. And then it's also partially shaded by this tree. So my plans for this one, eventually I will move it. However, I do like having a kind of small and compact version of Olivia Rose Austin as well. It's much easier to maintain and it still looks quite pretty. So I'm just going to do a little bit of deadheading on that one. Next, let's go up to the next section of our garden. Bear with us while this bit of the garden is a little bit messy. This is James Galway. This is a climber by David Austin. The colour looks different this year to how it looked last year. It looked a lot more red in the centre of the rose last year, whereas now it's quite a faded pink colour. I am surprised that this one's flowering at all, given that it's more or less in complete shade. I've definitely planted it in the wrong place. But my aim for this area, again, is to cover the fences with something. However, I think perhaps a climbing rose wasn't the best idea, given how little sunlight this area gets. But who knows, it is flowering. It should be a repeat flowerer, but last year it didn't repeat flower. I think it's just not getting enough light. So possibly I will train it further along the fence towards the sunlight. That's something to think about as time goes on. But it's looking really lovely now, and just a little bit of deadheading to do there. Now let's go to the other side. This is a work in progress too. What I'm starting to do here is create a rose hedge, and I'm using the rose Emily Bronte, again by David Austin. It's a shrub rose that you can use to create a hedge, and I'm just going to pull it forward so you can see the flowers. They're really gorgeous, yellow, orange sort of colour in the middle, and then they fade to a pink on the outside. They look absolutely stunning. I love this rose, but as you can see, it may need to be deadheaded. So I have 3 of these plants, however, they are all really young, so it doesn't look very impressive yet, but I'm hoping over the next couple of years this will pad out slightly. Some things that I deal with in this area that are making it difficult are the shade from this tree. I have actually pruned this back a lot already, but I think I need to do it a bit more just to let some more light in here. And these are shade tolerant roses, but they do need some light. And I've also got sceptred isle on the end of this rose hedge here, and that was just because I didn't have another Emily Bronte rose at the time, so I moved this one down here. This rose has actually struggled to get established, and it seems like it's quite unwell. I will give that a deadhead. It looks better than it did last year, but last year it looked really unhealthy. However, the Emily Bronte roses are doing really well, and hopefully next year we can look at this and it will look a bit more interesting. So there are actually 2 new rose plants behind me that haven't flowered yet. I bought these as bare root roses at the very end of bare root season, must have been February sort of time. One of them is called Scarborough Fair. The other one, I can't remember the name, but they are both gifts that friends gave us as a wedding present. We got married last September. and so I planted those late winter. They haven't flowered yet, they're still getting established, and I do need to clear this area out because it was very overgrown when we moved in, and I'm still trying to keep on top of it, but that's something to look forward to in possibly this year, maybe next year. This rose here is called the Generous Gardener, and I wish it was flowering so I could show you how amazing the flowers are, but you can see there's a lot of buds on there. This one I planted when we moved in, so 3 years ago, and it gives me a lot of hope for how big the other roses are going to get, while most of our roses are new. I wanted this to cover the wall, and it's done that already, so we'll probably continue to climb it over the duck enclosure. But you can see there's an amazing amount of buds on here, and I'm quite surprised because this is a very shady area. It gets a little bit of sun, I think, in the morning, but in the afternoon it's more or less in complete shade, so I wasn't expecting this to perform as well as it has, but there's so many buds on there. I really can't wait to see how this looks in a week or two's time. We had a small flush of flowers, which I'm going to deadhead now, but probably only about 3. However, they were really pretty. And then to the other side of me, this is more of a messy area, but I've planted a rose here that's called Seagull, or otherwise known as Rambling Rector, and it's a rose that comes with a warning because it grows so aggressively, but my aim is to climb it up this plum tree, just so that there's a good sequence of flowers that feed the bees. As you may have noticed, most of the roses that I've showed you so far are completely useless to pollinators because they spend most of their lives completely covered in really tight ruffled petals, so it's good to have these single flowering roses. Though they might look a bit more old-fashioned, a little bit more simple, they are a good thing to have in the garden. So that one has put on a lot of growth already. I can see why people say be careful with it. This one I only planted about half a year ago, I think, in the winter, and you can see it's about 1.5 meters tall already, so in no time we'll have that scrambling through the trees up there, and I'm sure I'll have fun complaining and trying to keep it a good size. So behind me, this is a part of the garden that we don't share too much on the videos because it's very much a work in progress. We installed these trellises as sort of a privacy screen between our garden and next doors, and the aim is to completely cover them with plants and have it be more of a living wall instead of a fence. However, at the beginning of that journey, it doesn't look very nice, but you can see I've planted this rose here, and again, this is a single flowering rose that will be better for the pollinators, and it will scramble across this quite quickly. It's called Francis Lester, and I got this one from our local garden centre. It was really cheap, I think it was about £4, but that should cover this trellis in no time. And then we've got some other evergreen climbers on there that should provide some coverage in the winter. And then you can also see behind me our new trough that we had installed yesterday, and this is just to allow us to get water for the ducks more easily. So we've had the whole garden plumbed, which is going to be really helpful. We do try to use rainwater for watering the plants, but for the ducks that's not an option, so we've got this installed. And then we do have another rose on this trellis. I don't know the name of it because it came from someone's garden sale, and it was £2, and the label said, it said Pink Climber Grows Quickly. So I don't know what that is, but I've put it on the trellis, and we'll see what happens. That's more of a surprise rose. And then I will now show you the one that we've got against our potting shed. Just a tiny rose to show you here, because again, this is another new one that went in at the start of spring, the end of winter. This one's called Silas Mana, and this one was a gift, again, from a friend when we got married. And our friend chose this rose because our dog's called Silas, and we named our dog Silas after the book, Silas Mana. We also have a dog called Epi, which is another character from the book Silas Mana, and my friend knew that we love David Austin roses, and we love Silas, our dog, so she chose this for us as a wedding present. So I really like the story behind that one, and this is the first time I've seen it flower. I need to be a bit careful that this one doesn't dry out because the shed does stop some of the rain from reaching it, so I do have to make sure I'm watering that one. But this is another one to look forward to as the weeks go by. So on either side of me, we've got a few more rose plants. Here, once again, we've got a trellis situation where the trellis isn't covered yet. It's very new, it still looks a little bit messy, but I've put 3 roses in this bed. There may even be more than that. I think there's 3 that I'm trying to climb. The first one, it's very hard for me to pronounce the name. It's something like Felicity Perpetu. If anyone can correct me on that, I would be very grateful. The second one, I planted about 2 years ago, and I didn't keep the tag. So I will try and find the name of that one, but I may not know what it is, but it's a single flowered white rose, and I believe it's a repeat flower as well, because that one seemed to flower quite a few times last year. And then thirdly, another David Austin rose. I believe this is another Emily Bronte. It might also be Desdemona. I did muddle the labels up when I put these in. it's a rose that isn't a climber. It's supposed to be grown as a shrub, but it doesn't really matter. You can still climb them. And what has happened here is I have a Clematis montana, and if you grow Clematis montana, you'll know it very easily ties itself to things. And what I've found is it's pulling the rose up and sort of tying it in for me as though it were a climber. And if I try to prune the rose, I can end up taking off bits of the clematis, which I don't want to do. So I'm going to leave it for a while and see how they behave with each other, and I'll just leave them to it, see what happens. At the moment it looks really lovely, but again, it's a young plant, so there aren't many flowers on there. So again, this is something to stay tuned for, and hopefully next year will look as amazing as the roses at the start of the garden. So give us a follow if you'd like to see how we get on. We'll keep sharing our progress in the garden with you. But I think the way we've done our roses is planting them nearer the house at the beginning, so we've got something to look at as we look out the window, and then over time we've been working on the bits further away from the house. And then on the other side here, we've got two rose plants in this bed. One of them is Desdemona, and Desdemona's not looking too happy at the moment because I moved it. It was growing in a very, very shady spot, and I just thought it is never going to flower if I leave it there. So last week I moved it. It was quite hot. I had to cut a lot of it back because it was drooping a lot, and it dropped a lot of its flowers. So again, one to stay tuned for. It's a really beautiful flower when it does flower, and it's a shrub rose by David Austin. And then the next rose, I'm just going to read the name because I've forgotten it. Apparently the next rose is called Lakeland. I will fact check that in case it's not true, but that's what I've written on the tag. It's a pink, I think it's a climber or a rambler, and I've just been training it on some sticks in a sort of tripod shape. I think it will outgrow that space because I've only had it in the ground since last August, so less than a year, and it's already put on a lot of growth. So that may be one that I move to the trellis, but at the moment it's looking really good in the middle of that border. And you will notice that these borders are a bit gappy this time of year. I'm someone that focuses most of my energy on spring, because I love to feel that sense of relief when you get through winter, and then in summer I feel much happier and I don't need to spend too much energy getting the garden in a way that will make me feel happy. However, it's resulted in lots of gaps. So I would love to know if anyone has any suggestions on how to fill the gaps in these borders. Most things do well here. We've got quite neutral soil. The soil's got enough nutrients in and they get a lot of sunlight. There are some also shady spots where I haven't found anything that works there. I've even tried putting hellebores and foxgloves in and they haven't done very well. So we are looking to add a few more roses into those gaps as well when we can afford it, but the David Austin roses are a little bit more on the pricier side, so we'll wait until we can get some more of those in. But for now, I hope you enjoyed looking around our rose garden. I can't wait to show you how this looks next year and the year after. Gardening is such a long-term gratification, but it's really lovely that we've got those flowers nearer the house that are already looking really big and amazing. So thanks for watching, give us a subscribe, and we'd love to share more of our garden with you.